She was looking straight back at me. I had a rule about this. A simple, self-imposed rule I'd been following for 7 weeks, which was how long Mara had lived in the building across the courtyard from mine. 6 feet of shared air between her kitchen window and mine. The same backlot light fixture casting the same orange-gray warmth into both our kitchens at dusk. She kept forgetting to close her curtains at night. Or she didn't forget. I'd noticed that she sometimes closed them and sometimes didn't, which meant she knew they were open and had made a decision either way, but I could never find the logic of when she chose which, and I'd stopped looking for it, because looking for it required thinking about her more than I already was. The rule was, if you happen to see her window while you're standing in your kitchen, you look at your own kitchen. You look at the counter, the dish rack, the water glass you've been meaning to move to the cabinet for 5 days. You look at anything that isn't a window. 7 weeks of mostly following that rule. Here is what the not following had added up to. A woman who read with the intensity of someone using books as an alternative to sleeping, who cooked elaborate things that involved a great deal of chopping at 11 p.m. when most people would have been eating cereal and watching something forgettable, who at some point in late December had rearranged every piece of furniture in her apartment, and then, over the course of 3 evenings, reconsidered and moved most of it back. Who, on one Wednesday night in December, had danced in her kitchen alone, not for an audience, not performing anything, just moving to something with enough bass that I could feel the faint vibration of it through the air. The way you move when you have genuinely forgotten that the world can see you. I hadn't knocked on her door. I hadn't waved. We'd shared an elevator twice and exchanged the careful, neutral pleasantries of 2 people who lived parallel lives at close range. The kind of pleasantries that establish you as a reasonable human being without committing to anything beyond that. I'd asked Gus the super, offhandedly, whether someone had moved into the apartment across the way, and that was how I'd learned her name was Mara. He'd said she was quiet, which was accurate in the sense that she didn't make noise, but inaccurate in every other sense. Because someone who dances alone in a kitchen at midnight and reads with the intensity of a person trying to outrun sleep is not quiet. They're someone whose inner life is running constantly and who has simply found a way to keep it interior. I'd noticed all of this. I'd looked away when I noticed. I'd followed my rule. Until tonight. She was standing at her window with a coffee cup held in both hands, looking across the courtyard with the focused stillness of someone who had been there for a while. Not startled. Not in the middle of something else. Looking, as if looking were the thing she'd come to the window to do. I did not look away. We looked at each other for what was probably 4 seconds, and felt like considerably longer. And then she did something I hadn't expected. She raised her coffee cup slightly, as if offering a toast to no one in particular, or possibly to me. I wasn't sure which. Then she stepped back from the window, out of my sight, and I was left standing at my sink holding a rinsed glass, looking at the empty rectangle of her kitchen, like someone who'd just been shown a door and wasn't yet sure whether they were allowed to knock. I put the glass down. I looked at my kitchen. Well, I thought. The next morning I went down to check my mail at 8, which was earlier than I usually went, but later than I'd wanted to go, which was 6:15, at which point I'd had a conversation with myself about what kind of person checks his mail at 6:15 a.m., and decided to be a different kind. She was already in the lobby. She was standing at the mailboxes with a small stack of envelopes, looking at the top one with the specific expression of someone who does not want to open what they're holding. Not fear, exactly. Something quieter than fear. The expression of someone who has been living with a particular problem long enough that they've stopped being surprised to encounter it, but haven't started being comfortable. She looked up when I came through the door. "Hi," she said. "Hi. I'm Mara." She said it without the awkwardness of formal introduction, more like confirming something she thought I already knew. Across the courtyard. "I know," I said. "Gus mentioned, when I asked if someone had moved in, I wasn't, there's a rule I give myself about." She smiled. Not laughing at me, more like she was familiar with this particular awkwardness, of becoming visible to someone who has been trying very carefully not to look. "Last night was my fault," she said. "I forgot to check the window before I turned the kitchen light on." A pause. "I usually check." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She dropped the stack of envelopes into her bag without opening any of them. It felt more honest to acknowledge it than to close the curtain and pretend it hadn't happened. "That's a thing I've been trying to do lately." Acknowledge things instead of pretending. Is it working? She considered this with genuine seriousness, which I hadn't expected. Inconsistently, she said. Then, more quietly, it's harder than it sounds. Acknowledging things. Yes, I said. It is. She looked at me like I'd said something unexpected. Then she smiled. I got my mail, a bill, a refinancing offer I was never going to act on, a birthday card from my mother that was 3 weeks late. I stood there with it for a moment. Do you want coffee? I said. I was going to make more, if you don't have somewhere to be. She looked at me for a beat. Not assessing exactly, more like deciding. Then, yes, okay. She sat on the tall stool at my kitchen counter and held the mug with both hands and looked at the window across the courtyard. Her own window, dark, curtains open, from the other side. I'd never thought about what it looked like from there. She didn't say anything about it, but she looked at it for a long moment, the specific look of someone taking inventory. We talked for over an hour, the way you talk with someone you don't know yet, when you're determining whether you might like to. She told me she'd moved from somewhere colder, that she'd been doing UX design for years and was freelancing now after leaving the firm she'd co-founded, that she had a library book 2 weeks overdue that she kept meaning to return and kept rereading instead. She asked about my work and actually listened to the answer without the glaze that people sometimes get when they've asked the question mainly to be polite. She had opinions about things and wasn't apologetic about having them, which was the kind of quality that's easy to underestimate and impossible to replace. She was also funny in the way that good listeners often are. She'd let something land completely before responding to it, which meant she was actually responding to what you'd said rather than to what she'd been formulating while you were talking. I noticed this the way you notice something that's rarer than it should be. She didn't say why she'd left the firm she'd co-founded. I didn't ask. I noticed that she'd dropped her mail into her bag without opening any of it, including the envelope she'd been studying in the lobby. I noticed the particular way she turned her head whenever she heard a car on the street below. Not alarm, just attention. A quick, habituated reflex. The kind that comes from a reason, practiced until it becomes automatic, which means the reason has been around for a while. When she left, she paused at my door for a second. The rule, she said. About the window, I think you can consider it suspended. Suspended, I said. As a formal posture. Obviously use your judgment. She looked at me. You seem like someone who has good judgment. I've been looking at your dishes for 7 weeks, I said. The jury's out. She laughed again, the real one, and went home. I went back to my kitchen and stood at the sink for a moment and thought about the fact that a person who checks her window before turning on her kitchen light every night had, apparently, decided I was not a thing she needed to check for. I put the glass away. She came back 2 nights later with a bottle of wine and the energy of someone who had been planning to stay home and then reconsidered at the last minute. The car is back, she said when I opened the door. Come in. I stepped back. What car? She set the wine on my counter and opened my cabinet on the first try, the right cabinet, without hesitation, as if she'd mapped the kitchen already, and got 2 glasses. A black Audi. It parks across the street and moves before midnight. It's been there 6 of the last 9 evenings, always the same spot, always gone by 12. She poured with the steadiness of someone maintaining composure through the specific mechanism of being very precise about everything. I don't know for certain it's him, I have no proof, but I know the car, I know that model because I looked at it once, when things were good, and thought we'd get one. Instead, I know what it looks like in a rearview mirror. Who is him? She handed me a glass and sat down on my couch, and I noticed she'd chosen the end with the better view of the window. His name is Daniel, she said. He was my business partner. And my boyfriend, for 2 years before we decided to be partners instead of just that. When I left, I tried to do it cleanly, divide the client relationships fairly, keep the split professional, give him no reason to make it worse than a breakup and a business dissolution needed to be. And he filed a civil suit claiming I violated the non-compete clause in our partnership agreement. 7 weeks ago. She looked at her glass. He says I solicited shared clients within the restricted period. I didn't. But a suit doesn't need truth to move forward. It needs to be filed. And it has been. And in the meantime, I can't work with any of the clients we shared, which is most of my roster, which means my income for the last 7 weeks has been... She stopped. I'm managing. I have savings. I'm managing. 7 weeks. I sat with the number. That's when you moved here, I said. She met my eyes. She knew exactly what I'd just assembled. I needed to be somewhere he didn't know about, she said. I found this apartment. I paid 3 months up front in cash. I didn't tell anyone who might tell him. For 6 weeks it held. And now the car. And now the car. She leaned back. The suit was never designed to win. That's the thing you have to understand about Daniel. He's not filing because he expects a judgment. He's filing because the process costs money and time and clarity, and the longer it runs, the more expensive leaving becomes, and the more expensive leaving becomes, the more attractive the alternative starts to look, the alternative being going back. The alternative being going back, she said it with a flatness that was not sadness, something more resolved than sadness. I left anyway. He doesn't quite know what to do with that. What is he like, I said, when he decides he wants something? She considered this. Patient, she said. Very patient, and genuinely gifted at appearing reasonable when he isn't. He doesn't yell. He doesn't threaten in any way you could record or repeat. He finds the angle where everything he's doing looks, from the outside, like something you're doing to him. She looked at her glass. There was a period, early on, when I would have tried to describe specific incidents to someone and heard them say, well, that does sound difficult, but also maybe he was just having a bad day. Not because they were wrong, but because each individual incident, isolated, looks like a bad day. It's only when you see all of them in sequence that you understand you're not in a relationship, you're inside a campaign. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't understand that until I was 2 years in, she said. And by then I'd built a business with him, which was the point. The relationship was a way to create interdependence that would make leaving expensive. He's been very good at this for a very long time, and he's never been wrong before about what someone would eventually do when the cost got high enough. He's never met the rule I give myself about windows, I said. She looked at me, startled. Then she laughed, not the careful lobby version, a real one. No, she said. I don't think he has. She went home at 11. I watched until her kitchen light came on, and she did check the curtains this time. Left a gap, not closed, not fully open. A middle distance I didn't have a category for yet. I went to bed without one and spent a while not sleeping, which was a different activity from sleeping in a way I couldn't quite explain. At 2:14 a.m. my phone buzzed. He left a note on my door. I sat up. We'd exchanged numbers when she left, in the offhanded way that wasn't offhanded. He knows which apartment. The note was there when I checked before bed. I don't know how long it had been there. What does it say? She sent a photo. 4 lines, handwritten, controlled. The penmanship of someone acutely aware of being read. I'm not angry. I just want to talk. You know the best version of this doesn't involve lawyers. Call me. Nothing you could show anyone and name as a threat. No specific language you could point to. Just 4 lines that, from one angle, read as a reasonable request from someone trying to be civil, and from the angle that came from knowing who'd written them, felt like a hand closing deliberately around a door handle. He hadn't said please. He'd stated. The absence of the word was the whole note. I'm coming over, I typed. You don't have to do that, I know. Coming. She opened the door before I knocked. The kitchen light was on. She was standing in the center of the room in the sweater from earlier, which meant she hadn't tried to sleep. He knew which door, she said. 12 units in this building. He knew the right door. He's been here before the car started, I said. The car was reconnaissance. He was already inside before he parked outside. She wrapped her arms across her chest. Not cold, something else. The motion of someone who has been holding a great deal together and is just now allowing herself to feel the weight of it. He knows I can't call the police, she said. A note on a door isn't a crime. He knows exactly where the line is. She looked at the note on her counter. And if I go to the police, he adds it to his narrative immediately. That I'm escalating. That I'm building a harassment story to muddy a legitimate contract dispute. He's been preparing that counter-narrative since before I left. I looked at her across the kitchen. At the bag near the door. At the box under the bed that she'd kept near the door in case she needed to leave quickly. At a woman who had done everything right and was still standing at 2 a.m. because someone had found her anyway. When does the suit go to a hearing? I said. 3 weeks. Maybe less, if he pushes it. She sat down. My lawyer says probably not. Probably the clause doesn't hold up. But probably doesn't pay rent, and probably doesn't give me back the clients I've been locked out of, and probably doesn't stop him from calling each of those clients and telling them why I ran. Does he have all the documents? I said. Your signed copy of the partnership agreement, do you still have yours? She looked at me. Something crossed her face. Not quite hope, something more cautious than hope. The expression of a person who has been being careful for so long they've stopped letting information arrive without first assessing the risk. It's in the box, she said. Under my bed, the one I kept near the door. Get it, I said. Now, I want to look at it with you. She got it. 12 pages of partnership agreement, her handwriting in the margins from the original read-through, small notes, questions she'd had before they'd finalized language, a coffee ring on the corner from some earlier session where they'd gone through the whole thing before anyone signed anything. I thought about that version of her, the careful one, who annotated and questioned and negotiated, who had crossed out a clause she knew was wrong and made sure it was initialed and dated, who had still ended up here, in her kitchen at 3 a.m, with the box from under her bed opened on the table. We spread it flat. She showed me the non-compete clause on page 8. Real, standard, unambiguous. It restricted client solicitation within 18 months of departure. She'd known it was there when she sat down to sign. So what happened? I said. I crossed it out, she said. She turned to the signature page. There, in the executed version in her hand, was a single diagonal line through the clause. One clean mark, 2 sets of initials alongside it. A date. 3 days before we signed, I told him I wouldn't execute without removing that clause. He agreed. We both initialed the deletion that same afternoon. And the version he filed with the court. My lawyer described the complaint as citing the clause as active, she said. Unmodified, as if this, she touched the initialed line, doesn't exist. I sat back. He filed a version without the deletion, I said. That's what the complaint suggests. Mara. That's not a breach of contract dispute. That's filing a document he knew to be altered with a court. I know what it is, she said quietly. She'd known for 6 weeks and carried it the way she carried everything. Carefully, alone, accounting for every scenario in which saying it out loud could cost her the remaining ground she had. If I'm wrong about any piece of it, if the date is off by a day, if my copy is somehow not the final version, then I become the person making wild accusations, and I lose the dispute and any credibility I had left. She looked at the cross-out. The 2 sets of initials, the date in his handwriting. But I'm not wrong. No, I said, you're not. Her phone lit up on the table between us. She read it and set it down. My lawyer, he filed today. She looked at me. The hearing is in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. The ticking clock I'd been aware of as background noise became suddenly central. Has he done this before? I said. Not to you, to anyone who worked with him before you, anyone who left the business and then disappeared from the field. She was quiet, thinking backward through what she knew. There was a woman, she said, a co-founder from his previous company. She left, there was some kind of dispute, and then she just stopped, left the industry entirely. I asked Daniel about it once, early on, and he said it had been amicable, that people move on. A pause. I believed him, because at that point I had no reason not to. What's her name? Celeste Park. She looked at me. She teaches now. I looked her up once, after things started going wrong with us. She seemed quieter than the person Daniel had described. I wrote the name on the back of an envelope lying on the table. What are you going to do with that? She said. I'm going to find out whether Daniel filed a partnership document in Celeste Park's case, I said, and whether her copy also had a deletion that his copy somehow didn't. She stared at me across the table. At 3 a.m, the courtyard dark outside, the coffee cups empty, she looked at me with an expression I was going to need time to find a name for. You don't have to, she started. You've said that to me twice now, I said, and both times you've said it in a way that makes clear you already know what I'm going to do. So let's just skip to the part where we figure out what you need. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at me. I need it to stop, she said. Okay, I said. Then let's stop it. Civil court filings are public record. This is one of those facts that becomes relevant at specific, unusual moments in life, and I was now in one of those moments. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an investigator, but I am someone who has spent years working with documents and knowing how to look for the shape of a thing in its metadata. What exists, what was filed, what was withdrawn, what was settled, and in what order. I found the case in under 2 hours, 7 years old, filed in another county, settled before the evidentiary hearing with sealed terms. The filing itself was public, they always are, unless a court orders otherwise, and no court had. Plaintiff: Daniel Reese. Defendant: Celeste Park. Cause of action: breach of contract and tortious interference with business relationships. The non-compete language cited in the complaint was identical, word for word, the same clause, to the language cited in Mara's complaint, across 7 years and 2 separate people who had left 2 separate businesses. I read that twice, slowly. The public docket showed that Celeste's attorney had filed a motion to dismiss on a specific ground, that the clause in question had been modified prior to execution, that both parties had initialed the modification, and that the document submitted by the plaintiff did not reflect the executed version of the agreement. The motion was denied because Celeste settled before the court ever put both copies side by side. She had the same cross-out, he had filed the same uncrossed version, and she had calculated the cost of staying in the room and decided that paying him to go away was cheaper than proving she was right. 7 years ago, she'd left the field entirely. Whatever he'd offered in the settlement, the price of accepting it had been an entire career. I sat with that for a long moment, with the shape of it, with the patience it required. He hadn't improvised this, he had learned it, tested it, and done it again because the first time it had worked perfectly. Celeste had settled. He had assumed Mara would too, because everyone does eventually when the cost is high enough. He'd never accounted for a neighbor with a rule about windows who had decided, quietly, to break it. I texted Mara at 5 a.m., Celeste Park, same clause, same filing. Her copy had the deletion. His didn't. She settled before the document comparison happened. The response came back fast. He's done this before. He has a system, I wrote. 2 instances is a pattern. A judge needs to see both. Then, after a pause, he's outside. I read it twice. The car? No. Standing on the sidewalk. Looking up at the building, I was already getting my shoes. He was exactly what I expected and somehow more unsettling for it. Composed and well-dressed, the specific kind of put-together that is meant to make you question your own read of the situation. He smiled when he saw me come down the steps. A deliberate smile selected for the moment. "You're her neighbor," he said. "I am. She's been talking to you." People talk to their neighbors. It's generally considered acceptable. He looked up at the building with the patience of someone who has never had to rush anything. "I just want to talk to her. That's genuinely all I've been trying to do. She's making this harder than it needs to be, and I think she knows that." At 5 in the morning, on the sidewalk outside her building, after a car that's been parked on this block for 2 weeks. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "Not a reason, a performance of reasonableness. She has documents relevant to an open legal matter. I'm entitled to." "Her attorney is receiving something this morning," I said. "A civil docket from 7 years ago." A motion to dismiss filed by Celeste Park's attorney on the specific grounds that the clause you cited had been deleted prior to execution, that both parties had initialed the deletion, and that the document you submitted to the court did not reflect the executed version of the agreement. I let that sit for a beat. Mara's copy has the cross-out. Both initials. Dated. Celeste's attorney described the same discrepancy 7 years ago. A court can look at all 3 versions in the same proceeding, at the same time, and compare what you filed to what both women signed. Something moved in his face, small. He was too controlled for anything large. Just the brief, precise recalibration of someone who has always found a route around things and is now, for possibly the first time, doing the math on whether this particular route exists. "Whatever she's told you," he said quietly, "this will cost her considerably more than she's prepared for." "She didn't set a fire and get framed for it," I said. "She has the document. You have the document you submitted. Those are 2 different documents, and one of them was filed with a court, and the court will eventually notice that." I paused. "I think you've always known that the system works because people settle before the comparison happens. Celeste settled. You assumed Mara would too." I looked at him. "You should go. He stood there for a long moment doing the calculation. Then he walked to his car and drove east and didn't come back. The counter motion went in on Monday. It cited the Celeste Park case, attached both versions of the agreement for direct comparison, and described a documented pattern of fraudulent document submission across at minimum 2 instances spanning 7 years. Daniel's attorney filed a response on Wednesday. Filed a withdrawal Thursday morning. The case was dismissed with prejudice the following Tuesday, 8 days after a 4-minute sidewalk conversation that had felt like less, which was faster than Mara's attorney had predicted and slower than I felt the situation deserved. She texted me when the dismissal came through. "It's done." The countermotion went in on Monday. Tuesday, Daniel's attorney filed a response. Thursday morning, a withdrawal. The case was dismissed with prejudice the following Tuesday, 8 days after a 4-minute sidewalk conversation, which was faster than Mara's attorney had predicted and slower than I felt the situation deserved. She texted me when the dismissal came through. "It's done." I was in my kitchen, standing at the sink, the same place I'd been when I looked up and found her looking back. Out of reflex, I looked at the window, and the curtains were open, and she was standing there with her phone in her hand. She saw me. She raised her coffee cup. I raised mine. She laughed. I could see it across the 6 feet of courtyard air even without hearing it. And then she stepped away from the window, and 30 seconds later there was a knock at my door. "The case is dismissed," she said when I opened it. "You texted." "I know." I wanted to say it out loud, to someone who understood what it meant. She came in, and I made coffee, and we sat in the specific quiet of something having been done, which is different from the quiet of something ongoing, and different again from the quiet of something new. "I called my clients this morning," she said. "The ones who'd been in limbo. I told them the case was dismissed, and 3 of them wrote back within an hour. 3 of them had been waiting." She looked at her mug. "I hadn't let myself think about what it would feel like to have them back, because I didn't want it in case I didn't get it. And then today I was allowed to want it. Is it what you thought?" She considered this. "Better," she said. "Quieter. I thought it would feel like winning, and it mostly feels like arriving. Like walking into a room that was always supposed to be yours, and finding it still there." "Celeste Park called me," she said, after the filing. She'd seen my attorney's name in the docket and looked me up. We talked for almost 2 hours. "How is she?" "Teaching middle school. Loves it." She was very clear about that. The way people are clear about something when they've worked hard to mean it. Mara looked at her mug. She said she almost didn't settle. That she had everything. The cross-out, both initials, the date on the modification. And she sat across from her lawyer and did the math and decided that winning was going to cost more than she had left to spend on it. She said she has thought about that calculation every year since. A pause. She's going to file an ethics complaint with the bar. She said talking to me made her remember that the choice to settle wasn't the same as agreeing he was right, and that there's a difference between those two things she'd been letting blur for 7 years. "It's worth doing," I said. "I'm going to do the same." She looked at me. "I want to tell you something." "Okay. I didn't expect to do any of this with someone," she said. "I'd built the entire architecture around doing it alone. I moved here in cash and told no one, and packed a box I could carry out in one trip, and was entirely prepared to see it through without any of this." She gestured at the coffee, at my kitchen, at the window across the courtyard where her curtains were open, as they had been, on purpose, for 5 weeks. "How's the architecture holding up?" She looked at me with the real version of her smile, not the lobby one, not the controlled one, the one that had been in her kitchen at midnight when she thought no one was watching. "Significant structural issues," she said. "Emerging data suggests a revision is required." I put my mug down. "I want this to be a real thing," I said. "Not the version where we did something difficult together and it fades into being neighbors who wave. A real thing, with dinner and time and the rest of it. A real thing." She sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her mug and held it the way she always did, both hands, like something worth keeping warm, and looked at me over the rim of it. "I've been leaving the curtain open on purpose," she said, "for 5 weeks." I looked at her. "That was a rule violation," I said. "A deliberate one," she said. "I wanted to see if you'd notice the difference between forgetting and deciding." She looked at me like the answer was obvious. "You followed the rule harder," she said. which was somehow the most endearing thing I'd ever seen anyone do. We had dinner that night, at the same table where we'd spread the documents at 3 in the morning, which was the same table but a completely different table. Halfway through it, I looked up and she was already looking at me, the way she'd been looking from across the courtyard the night this started, and I thought, this is what it looks like when something has already been going on. When the counting starts not at the moment you decide, but at some earlier, quieter moment that you only name in retrospect. What was the first week? I said. What do you mean? You knew before I did. What was the moment? She was quiet for a moment. You held the elevator for me, she said, and then you looked at the floor the entire ride up. I sat with that for a moment. With the specific image of myself, 2 months ago, holding a door for someone, and then studying the elevator floor with extraordinary concentration, because looking at her would have been something, and I didn't know yet what kind of something, and I was being careful. I was trying to be respectful, I said. I know, she said. That was the part. She looked at me across the table. You'd already decided I was someone you should be careful with, before you knew anything about me. I looked at her. You'd left the curtain open, I said. She smiled. Yes, she said. I had. I won't look tonight, she said later, at the door, meaning across the courtyard. She did look. I didn't look away. If you've ever made a rule for yourself about someone, a careful, reasonable rule, the kind that protects you from wanting something you weren't sure you were allowed to want, and followed it faithfully right up to the moment it became exactly the wrong thing to do, you understand what it is to be standing at a sink holding a rinsed glass and thinking, well, have you ever realized that the person you were so carefully not watching had been watching you? Not pushing, not crossing any line, just present, in the specific way of someone who decided you were worth the patience before you gave them a single reason to. And who came to mind just now when you read that? Not a feeling, a person, someone specific, with a name and a face and a moment you can point to, something small, something ordinary, something that looked from the outside like nothing at all. Write their name in the comments. Write the moment. Because the most important things that have ever happened to most of us arrived looking exactly like that. Like someone looking away politely in an elevator, like a coffee cup raised through a window at night, and almost none of the people in them ever found out what they started. If this is your first time here, welcome. There's more.